Now that we've looked at some of the differences between writing and speaking, I want to take that example that we watched with our two speakers and move into this next realm of performance and communication orientation. This very much relates to this speaking and writing division. The issue is we don't want to perform written works as oral ones. I'll come back to this, but speech writing is a separate issue here. Rather, in this class, we're going to adopt a communication orientation. Now, on this, I take my terminology here from the work of Michael Motley. And if you're interested, we'll return back to this when we talk about fear of public speaking. But he has a slim volume on overcoming your fear of public speaking where he fleshes these terms out that I find very instructive. So what I would like to do right now is just talk a little bit about understanding the difference between communication and performance orientation, and then analyzing some of these differences through some YouTube clips. So to begin with, I want you to think about performance and communication orientation as a continuum. And we have various types of speech performances that sit somewhere on this continuum. The speeches that we just had in our last lecture, where we had Heather reading the manuscript and Danny talking about why he chose the University of Washington, those would be pretty much on the polar extremes here. I gave Heather a manuscript and she read it, okay? And Danny just was given a brief prompt and he spoke about the reasons he knew, okay? So, but we can use that, but communication, performance and communication are ways of thinking about how you're preparing and how you're interacting with the audience. And performance here is kind of a metaphor. So you can also think about performance as if you go to see a stage play. Okay? It is about getting the exact words exactly right. So on the one extreme, we could say performance orientation tends to be more literary. At the most extreme, people are dealing with a full manuscript. Now, in some cases, that's ideal. Once again, if you go to a stage play, let's say you go to a performance of Hamlet, Shakespeare's Hamlet, people are going to hear those words. They're not going to hear the actor get up there and go, "To be or not to be? What a question. What do you think, audience?" No, they're not doing that. They're going there to hear those exact words. But so in this case, performance is a full-on manuscript. Now on the other end, we've got a communication orientation, which would be more aimed at an oral performance. In the example that we saw in the last lecture, Danny didn't have any notes. As we're going to be practicing and working on the communication orientation in this class, you're probably going to be working with a minimal outline. And that's because we want to get more to a dynamic exchange and interaction with the audience. Now in a performance orientation, since the manuscript is the thing, the words are the thing, that presentation is either going to be completely read or it's going to be memorized. We really want to avoid that. You heard some of this in Heather, who is a very talented speaker, but in reading that manuscript, there are things that are going on that are going to make it more difficult for you as a listener to follow along with. There were pause breaks that are going to be blurred over. There are words that are not going to be intoned exactly as they would be if you were speaking naturally. Reading a manuscript perfectly as it sounds when you're communicating naturally, when you're in a conversation, that's sort of leaving the realm of speaking and entering the realm of acting. That's why acting's so tough, right? Because acting is usually about taking words that are not your own and making them sound like they are coming out at that moment. That's tough. That's a lot of work. And certainly memorizing is cognitively taxing. It takes a lot of time to do it. And I'll go ahead and take this brief digression here. It's an anecdote I use. I'll go ahead and put it in here. So a couple of years ago, I'm often asked to go do panels on public speaking. And at this particular one, I was sitting there, and it was me, and there was a television producer, and then there was a woman who was the president of her speech club. And she was asked to do a presentation on presentations. So this woman gets up, and she had memorized her performance, and you can hear it. She had memorized that performance, and you could just hear it in her tone. And she's going through, and you can imagine what's happening here. She reached the point where the words, as they were inscribed in her brain, just went blank. And it was in a very unfortunate time because it was something like, and so what's tremendously important when you're talking about speech is, what's tremendously important when you're talking about speeches is, what's tremendously important when you're talking about speeches is, to focus on the audience, and then it continued to go downhill from there. What had happened is she had reached the end of her memory, and so that sentence kept rebooting in hopes that it would load to the end. And let me tell you, it didn't. So memorization can create problems, because if that memory goes, it may bring you down with it. Okay? But on performance side, if the manuscript's a thing, it's either going to be completely read because we got to get those words right, or it's going to be memorized, or just focus on the word. Communication orientation, we're looking more at its practice. You know the structure of that. You know the arrangement of that speech, but it's interactive. The metaphor here is performing, standing up in front of an audience and doing a show, or communicating. In our approach to public speaking, for what we're doing here, the focus is on communication. That audience should be an active participant in the creation of meaning. Okay? You're not just speaking and they're not there. You're, as I'm doing right here, but you're actually speaking and there's an audience there. And through the combination of your words and their comprehension, you're creating this communication event. In a performance orientation, you would merely speak at the audience. So again, to go back to that Hamlet show, that Hamlet play is going to pretty much sound the same if it's an audience of 1,000 or if it's an audience of 10. The audience there is not an active factor in what's happening on the stage. The other way of thinking about this is when you fly, right, and you're hearing the flight attendant go through their spiel at the beginning, buckle your seatbelt, don't be an idiot, whatever they say in those opening spiels. The fact that I can't remember, and I've heard it so many times, is perhaps indicative of how effective that is as communication. But that flight attendant, you can hear it. It's plastic, it is canned, it is memorized, and it's going to sound the same if the flight is packed or if the flight is empty. They have to say those words. But the audience isn't an active member of that exchange. Okay? Now, communication orientation, since we're dealing with a minimal outline, since it can be interactive, you're speaking with the audience. You're communicating with the audience. Okay? If they're falling asleep, you got to adapt. If it's hot in the room, you got to sort of make it count for that. You're adapting to this evolving speech setting. And the communication is there, and the audience is an active member of its creation. Now, we have some, indication that a performance orientation can be more nerve-wracking. Certainly, you can think of it this way. If you're reading a speech, if you're reading a manuscript and you get a word wrong, it's wrong. The threshold is pretty low. Now, if you're speaking and you get something wrong, you can adapt. When we speak in conversation, we don't restart a sentence when we get it wrong, right? It's much more dynamic based on our conversational partner. So there's some indication that, at the very least, adopting a communication orientation is one tool in helping you reduce your communication apprehension. But the issue here is performance orientation means writing it out full ahead of time and hoping that's going to save you, just reading it. But the thing is, based on the fact that you're working in a medium designed for visual apprehension, there's so many elements that are going to be run over. Performance orientation typically, not always, typically tends to be faster than naturally occurring speech. Read manuscripts are probably going to be more monotone because you're not in the moment, so all those naturally occurring vocal variety, changes in pitch and tone that are going to happen as a result of us being language-using animals are probably going to be flattened out if you're reading a speech. Okay? Now, there are lots of exceptions to this. Okay? So, here in the U.S., the State of the Union address is this major address by the president. It's manuscripted. It's written out. The president doesn't get up there and wing it. It's not my fellow Americans, the State of the Union is strong-ish. How's everybody doing? Oh, it's hot out today. No president's doing that. It is manuscripted. But this is why speech writing can be a very delicate art, because you are writing something ahead of time that's going to sound natural. Writing for the ear takes practice. And we'll get to some of that later in this class. But for our initial approach, overall, we just want to be thinking, how can we work within the communication orientation? How can we work within this oral medium? And what it's going to translate to is knowing our speech, practicing our speech, but at the moment of speaking, generating a lot of the words spontaneously, as we do in conversation, right? Conversational speech is the norm, and honestly, everything else is a derivation. So we want to work within this aspect of communication that we have mastered so well as humans. Tap into its power, structure it more, because we want to be very clear, but tap into the power of conversational speech as a way of reducing apprehension, increasing clarity, and just making the entire speech endeavor more enjoyable. So, what I would like you to do now is we're going to take a look at some sample clips. You will see there should be a link at the end of this video. Certainly there's a link on the introduction page for this week. I've got a separate YouTube channel set up specifically for this class, and there's a playlist around performance and communication orientation. What I want you to do, and I've segmented usually about 2-minute clips from each speaker, what I want you to do is at the end of this lecture, go watch those sample speeches, those snippets of speeches. And I want you to watch them with two things in mind. One, where would you locate this person on that performance, communication, orientation continuum? Okay? Where would you locate them along that, and why? You know, are they totally on one side or the other? They're somewhere in the middle, maybe one part's at one side, one part's at the other. So that's question one. Where would you locate them? Question two, what are they doing in terms of performance and communication orientation that you think is effective or ineffective? Are they reading directly? Are they monotone? Are they engaging? Are they funny? What are they doing in terms of performance, communication orientation that you think is working or not? Now, I will admit these are largely American examples, and these are ones that I've used. I hope in the discussion forum that you'll also be able to suggest some other ones that illustrate one or the other of these extremes. I'm also going with famous speakers here, simply because I don't want to grab some poor schlub's, speech that he posted for 10 people and then throw it to the world and say, analyze this schmuck. Let's see what he's doing terrible. So I'm aiming for that as a function of this course, because I want to be fair and open to anyone who's participating. But as you watch these clips, think through those two questions and then go to the discussion forum, also linked on the weekly page. Go to that discussion forum and discuss these two issues. Where would you locate the speakers, and what are they doing that's effective or ineffective? I hope this will be a very enlightening conversation.